And so, without further ado, our first speaker today is quite simply a brilliant European New Right thinker, scholar and educator who has written many incredible books, including Against Democracy and Equality, The European New Right, and his latest, Homo Americanus, Child of the Postmodern Age. It really is a great honour to have him here. Please welcome Tomislav Sunic.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks also for your confidence. I need to thank Joe and Ben and other guys who picked me up the other day and who actually organized this meeting. You probably know something about me, about my background. I was born and I was raised in ex-communist Yugoslavia. So I'm pretty much familiar with the vocabulary and with the locutions of the communist newspeak and its replica now in the so-called Free West. My background is also in comparative linguistics, and I'm primarily concerned with words and how those words are modified and how those words are used and abused by different scholars and different politicians. And I have a specific reason to mention that, because when we deal with expressions like identity, sovereignty, patriotism, the first thing we got to ask ourselves is who defines those words? What those words mean in a specific political environment and in a specific historical context. Take, for instance, I know it sounds a little bit trivial. Take the word, for instance, democracy. Now we take this word democracy as a archetype, you can say, as a paradigm of the best of all worlds. However, let's say at the beginning of the 20th century, the word democracy did not have such a positive meaning. Or take another extreme, the word fascism or Nazism. Now they have completely lost their original meaning. What do they stand for, those words? Those words primarily stand for as shut up words. If you want to discredit your enemy, you call him a fascist or you call him a Nazi. So even Madame Merkel or even Benjamin Netanyahu, they were all called at some point fascists and Nazis. So we got to be extremely careful even when you listen to me, and even when you read some of my prose, let alone if you read the prose of some of the politically correct academics, please ask yourself, and I'm appealing especially here to students, try to figure out what type of words, what type of vocabulary they use. We frequently mention here George Orwell. I'm sure you're familiar with this standard work of his, 1984, but I would suggest to you to read first and foremost his essay on the English language, where he talks about those semantic distortions, semantic deviations. I'm probably best familiar with that. I'm not saying this with some utmost pride, because I knew that. I lived through that back when I was a boy, back when I was a young boy, back in communist Yugoslavia, where the words anti-fascism and fascism were on the public menu 24 hours a day. Like all opponents of the communist regime in communist Yugoslavia, even the left-leaning opponents, even the dissident communists, even social democrats in a communist regime in communist Yugoslavia from 45 until 90 were declared summarily fascists. So again, be careful even what I'm talking about. I have a problem with those words like sovereignty and identity for obvious reasons, because those words can also have multiple meanings. In the German language, please keep that in mind also, that the word der Souveränist, they use now the word der Souveränist, der Patriot, der Identitäre, but those words sound a little bit odd in traditional German ears. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the German lingo or the German language. Now keep in mind that after the Second World War, the German language was subjected to, how can I say, to a linguistic ethnic cleansing. So many words in the German language had to disappear. For instance, the word folk, Völkisch, which cannot be translated into the English language. It has an entirely different meaning, Völkisch. Völkisch was a very popular word even prior to the National Socialist arrival to power. The word Volksgenosse, which is nowadays completely disappeared from the public discourse in Germany, and which literally means the fellow patriot, Volksgenosse. But this word sounds so odd, so awkward in the modern public discourse, and of course it's not very politically correct. And on top of it, it is almost legally banned, so it's very seldom in usage. There are many of those old German words associated with the notion of the patriotism and so on, and I could go on and on. For instance, take the word, which is pretty unique in the German language, artfremd, which means literally an alien of a different biological stock. It didn't have a pejorative, it didn't have a derogatory meaning at the early 20th century. However, nowadays it has disappeared completely from the German vocabulary. This again has to do with the Second World War. You know what happened after the Second World War. It was not just the end, a military end of an experiment, it was also an end of a certain way of communication, because of course it was in the interest of the winning powers, of the Allied powers, to impose on the German people not just a new vocabulary, but also a new way of identity. I'm not making any value judgment whether this was for good or for bad, but this was the fact of the matter. To some extent, we can also trace this development in the UK and in France, let alone in the United States of America. Now, I may declare myself in public, I'll just give you an example, a patriot or a sovereignist, which I certainly am, and I'm proud of it. But it doesn't automatically follow that my enemy or my detractors, or let's say the mainstream media, would concur with this self-designating label of mine. They would likely call me, like they did back in communist Yugoslavia in the 60s and 70s, that I'm a right-winger, that I'm a Nazi, that I'm a fascist, and so on and so forth, or that I'm a white supremacist, whatever that word means. So please, again, I'm appealing to you, study the etymology of words and how those words change in each political environment and with each political class in power. Let's just say a few words about identitarian. This word identitarian, and I'm sure you have thought about this, sounds very romantic, and I like it very much. However, ask yourself a question. I could now, of course, refer you to quite a few of the books, including Alain de Benoit wrote about this. A couple of authors in Canada wrote about this, very scholarly books about identity. Now, one thing we need to state here very explicitly, we have to distinguish between acquired identity and inborn identity. When somebody asks me, Tom, how would you identify yourself? Now, how would I answer? Am I a Croat or am I an American? I am both. I have a dual citizenship. Or am I a hyphenated Croat or am I a hyphenated American? I frankly have no idea. I mean, to some extent also it refers to yourselves. On the professional level, I can display also multiple identities. I can be a musician, I can be an author. I guess I would probably identify myself as a translator, as a poet, because I like poetry, as a thinker, as an author, I guess. How successful, you can judge it yourselves. So you understand that when we talk about identity, when we talk about identitarians, we gotta also be very specific. We just cannot toss those words around without conveying the proper meaning to our audience or to our detractors, if you wish. Now, there is also the religious identity. Am I a Catholic? Yes, I was born in a Catholic environment. Am I agnostic? Could be. So again, this term of identity can be extrapolated in many even awkward, in many, many situations in a very awkward way. Then, of course, nowadays, what type of identity we are talking about? Mostly about sexual identities, transgender identities, the homosexual identities. And I guess I could enumerate them until tomorrow, and I'm sure you could do the same thing. And finally, there is also one identity which, for a variety of reasons, we don't want to talk about very much. And I'm sure you know which one I have in mind. This is our inborn identity. I myself, I'll tell you, look, I've read Galton, I've read Haldane, I've read Richard Lynn very much. I'm on good terms with Richard Lynn, Philip Rushton. I knew quite a few back in the States, and even nowadays I know quite a few sociobiologists. Now this field of ethnic identity, I hate to use the word racial identity, was very, very prominent in Britain and in the United States of America in the first half of the 20th century. And even now, there's this ethnic, or let's put it, hereditary identity, I'm not going to use the word racial identity, is being debated in American academia much more freely than in the United Kingdom, let alone in Germany. Why I'm raising these provocative questions? Look, I can learn my different identity. I can become an American citizen, I can become a UK citizen, I can dismiss with my culture, I can dismiss with my language, I can live in Hong Kong, I can actually even forget my language and I can learn a new one. But there is one thing I cannot dismiss, there's one thing I cannot renounce on. This is my biological identity. For a variety of reasons, as said, for basically politically correct reasons, for the reasons of self-censorship in academia, this hereditary, let's call it racial identity, is not being debated very much. In fact, even the word race has received a very, 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 very pejorative connotation. Except, of course, when do we use this word race? When we talk about racial riots and when we talk about those bad and ugly white racists. This is probably the only occasion when race is being used. So instead of that, I will use the word heredity. Again, my point is, this is my first point that I would like to make, we just cannot dismiss identities. We cannot talk about those professional or acquired identities unless we also bring into the fore, bring into our discussion our biological identity. Whether I like it or not, people I meet that tell me, well, Tom, you look like your dad, you have your mom's eyes, you behave sometimes like your grandparents, so I cannot dismiss the fact, and I must say I'm proud of it. I'm not making a federal case of it, but I'm proud of my ancestors. My ancestors didn't just speak the creational language. They were not just Europeans. They had certain skills. They had probably certain defaults. They had certain flaws. And I have to accept them as such. So please keep in mind, when we talk about identity, let's keep also in mind that we have our heritage, which is also of a biological nature. To what extent this biological factor is important, I don't have no idea. I'm not saying that this is the only one. Please do not fall into this trap of biological determinism. This is what I call racism then. A person who makes the federal case out of his biceps, out of his blondness or whatever, in my view, is silly, and it's not a good man to start with, you know. And I'm just saying the obvious. We have to look a little bit more deeply into this ethnic and hereditary component of our identity, which, for obvious reasons, has been, in our multicultural societies, has been completely dismissed. This will lead us to the phenomenon that I will then respect the otherness, the other, just as much as I respect myself. And I'm telling you that, if you allow me this little digression, from my old past Yugoslav experience. Back in communist Yugoslavia in the early 60s, I was then 10 years of age, probably a little bit younger. this concept of multiculturalism. Keep in mind, Yugoslavia was more or less, on a biological level, if you wish, on the ethnic level, they were more or less the same, except for different cultures. But we were constantly fed by the communist propaganda in school and elsewhere that we are all equal, that we are all perishable, that we are all expendable, that we can be changed and rechanged and modified. Look how it all ended up. I hate to say that, and I don't want to disappoint some folks or alienate folks. I am very skeptical about multicultural societies. If this multicultural experiment didn't work in ex-communist Yugoslavia between similar peoples, albeit with different cultures and different languages, I wonder how is this going to work in the United States of America, which has undergone a tremendous demographic shift over the last 30, 40 years. With all due respect, I frankly have no idea. If you look at South Africa, if you look at Pakistan and India in the 47, 48, even if you look at the model country Israel, I'm not taking sides, folks, by the way. We also have a big wall which separates two different destinies. Wall which is almost 500 miles, 700 kilometers long. The wall which keeps two different peoples together, each of those peoples having their own sense of identity, own explanation of identity. As a former professor back in the States, I remember talking to Israeli or Jewish scholars who were just as persuasive as some of the Palestinian colleagues and friends, who actually made the point about their identity, Palestinian identity. So it's up to you which side you want to choose. Let's look at sovereignty then. I'm tossing at you the cluster of those words, patriotism, identity, and sovereignty, because I actually have to keep them together in one fold, because they are not synonyms, but we have to use them when we talk about identity or our patriotism. Sovereignty is a very popular word, guess where? In France. In France, it's commonly used by my colleagues, by my Alain de Benoit, by what the French nationalists, they all use the word Marine Le Pen, she uses the word souverainiste, they call it souverainiste. In French, in English language, there's not an exact translation for it. The word souverainiste refers to Québécois, to the French-speaking Canadians in a region of Quebec you're familiar with. Quite a few of people, 5-6 million of them. So, as of recently, this word sovereignist has been replanted into our jargon, into Europe, in a way also to express our own feelings of our own identity. Yes, we are sovereignists because we want to preserve our sovereignty. Again, we have a problem, ladies and gentlemen. How to define sovereignty in which context? Let me give you an example. First from Britain, then from Croatia, and then from France. Many English patriots or sovereignists, and I'm pretty much sure there are some among you, some among us, and rightfully so, do not like the Brussels bureaucracy poke its nose into the British affairs. So we are sovereignists. I guess you will agree. You are in agreement with me. However, at the same time, many of us, many of you, with all due respect, we are not too keen about defining the Irish, the Scottish, or Welsh identity, let alone great and full-fledged sovereignty. Let's be self-critical. I'm trying to picture myself, and I'm always trying to empathize both in a positive and a negative way with my detractors and with my friends. I'm trying to figure out what's crossing the mind of a person in Northern Ireland. I met some of them. I was in Chicago and elsewhere. And how they actually make that point about their identity, which is sort of a negative identity based on anti-Britishness. And this reminds me, if you can follow me, I'll repeat it. This reminds me of many Croatian nationalists, who call them patriots. They very often resort to this negative identity. Based on what? They are Croats as long as they hate Serbs. And I don't think this is a valid approach to defining our identity. I cannot hate the Irish. I cannot hate the British just because I'm Irish. And I met quite a few of Irish who don't like the British, who don't like the English. And I met lots and lots of Croats, my colleagues, some of my close friends, I can say, who are really obsessed with their Croatian nationalism, or Croatian patriotism. They use the word sovereignism as well. But their whole discussion circles around anti-Serbian rhetoric. And it makes me sometimes, I don't want to say sick, it just makes me, look, that's a non-starter. Now my question, my rhetorical question is, what would you do? How would you define your identity where there are no Serbs then? How would you define your identity, let's be blunt, if there were no Jews? Do I need to have Jews in order to be anti-Semite? You understand the point? So let's try to define our identity without looking at the negative other. Let's be what we are. I don't have the ready-made answers for us. I'm just raising here some questions, both of the linguistical nature, legal nature, and political nature, and it's for us to solve them. I don't have answers to them. I'll probably give some answers later on. Croatian patriots, as I said, or let's call them with a proper noun, Croatian nationalists, get very upset when some high EU politicians mention the possibility of the restitution of the third Yugoslav state in the former multi-ethnic Yugoslavia. And they're very upset, and they have big reasons for that, because Croatian nationalists took them quite a while to get rid of this fold of Yugoslavia. You know what happened in 91, from 91 to 95 in this terrible war, unnecessary war in ex-Yugoslavia. However, the very same patriots, when they talk about their sovereignty, are very little, not all, but are very little concerned about the ukases or decrees coming from Brussels and Strasbourg. You see the paradox. On the one hand, they want to uphold their sovereignty as far as the tentative threat of Yugoslavia is concerned. On the other hand, they fully embrace all the decrees from Brussels. In my own opinion, this is my subjective opinion, I think that Brussels and the EU bureaucracy is far worse than Yugoslavia to start with. You know? So I'm not happy with the present European Union, and I myself, regardless of what you may guys think, I'm fully a big supporter of Brexit, and I hope that other countries will also follow suit. Not necessarily dismiss the European Union, but the Brexit, in fact, the whole European Union, again, I could spend a whole lecture on it. Just got to first state clearly and precisely what is European Union all about. As of now, this is just an economic, sort of a mercantile entity with very little cultural underpinnings, very little political underpinnings. And I think it's false. And the sooner, I don't want to say the sooner it disrupts, the sooner it is remodified, the better for all of us. And finally, of course, we come to the French sovereignty. The French, it's a very popular word. You can hear it everywhere in France, souverainiste. All my friends, all my colleagues talk about souverainism. But then they have the same story, almost like in Britain, you know. Marine Le Pen, she calls herself souverainiste. Yes, on a subnational level, those French souverainists, or that's the way how they call themselves, are not too eager. Guess what? I'm sure your guess is right. Not too eager to talk about the Catalans, the Corsicans, the Basques, the Alsatians, or Breton souverainists, let alone grant them sovereignty and full-fledged statehood, because this would be in contrast, this would be in conflict with the French souverainists. Again, I don't know the answer for it, but I would again appeal to you when you declare yourself as identitarian, try to be as specific as possible. The same goes for you who label themselves as sovereignists. Now, I guess I still have some time left, and there is also an institutional problem, ladies and gentlemen, and which is of far bigger and far more, should I say, dangerous nature. On the external and institutional level, the use and misuse of the notion of identity is getting even more complicated for all sovereignists, all identitarian parties and movements, regardless of how small and how big they are. Sovereignists made very good breakthrough during the recent European elections, particularly the Vlaams Blok. You know the Vlaams Blok in Belgium and Flanders. They did very well. They had many elected people now in the local parliament, and then we'll have quite a few folks in the European Parliament as well. Also, Marine Le Pen, le Rassemblement National, which used to be the Front National, they did very well. Let's, however, face the fact, and I guess this is probably the main topic, the main theme of my thesis, the main thesis of my speech. And this is the thesis that we seldom discuss. The liberal parliamentarian system, since the end of the Second World War, claims to be the best of all worlds. Yet in reality, we can see daily that this is not always the case. Overall, all parties, even the Tories or the Labour, and not just in the UK but elsewhere in Europe, once they are in office, have a great difficulty in implementing their own program, assuming that they are really committed and really resolved to do so. Now, and as far as nationalists, or let's call them patriotic parties, are concerned, you see that with BNP and elsewhere in Europe, as far as the nationalists or patriotic parties are concerned, they basically have no chances of entering the mainstream politics. Ever since the Second World War, barriers have been erected, different trenches, if I can put it that way, have been dug in order to prevent them from exerting any executive power. You can see that with FPO in Austria, you can see it with NPD, you can see it even with the alternative. You can see it even with the Front National. In other words, what I'm saying, even those mild sovereigns or patriot parties have great hurdles in front of them in order to become a factor on a federal level, on a state level, in decision making. And I guess we have to put up with that. If we add to that a factor of globalism and the omnipotence of various supranational bodies such as WTO, the EU, and the United Nations, and of course the global financial market, well, then we must ask ourselves ironically or sarcastically somewhat, to what extent is our drive to sovereignism or identitarianism even feasible and possible? If we constantly get smeared, if we constantly get attacked and labeled as fascist or bad guys or criminals and so on. This is something I have troubles with. Now, in my conclusions, ladies and gentlemen, before we start delivering some positive and affirmative suggestions as to how to strengthen our patriotism, we must first and foremost grasp the main political category, which is how to distinguish between foe and friend. I know what's crossing your mind. Most of us here, most of you here think, wow, we have problems with Muslims, we have problems with Islamic threat, we have problems with non-European Muslims coming here and actually storming the country and taking our jobs and whatever, just replacing the original populations with a different gene pool, if I can put it that way. I guess what we are missing, what many of my colleagues in souverainists and patriots are missing, is the gap between causes and consequences. We don't want to look at the consequences. What we want to look at are the causes. I don't blame, for my part, the Muslims. I don't blame the non-Europeans coming here. I blame first and foremost our own elites, our local elites, who for a variety of reasons have opened up those floodgates to those Muslims, if you wish, to those non-Europeans. And I guess the consequences will be bad, not just for the in-groups, for the local people, but also for the incomers from different parts of the world. I know it firsthand. In fact, when somebody talks about racism, I know friends who spent some time in jail back in the States, not for political reasons, but for different reasons, whatever. And in the United States of America, if you're in jail, you gotta belong to your tribe, because otherwise there are slim chances of survival, if you know what I mean. You're sort of oppressed, even if you're an apostle of multiculturalism, even if you're truly a nice guy, but you just gotta join your in-group. You just gotta join, if you wish, your gang, if in such a strategy of survival. I'll give you some more examples. Among European patriots of different stripes, it has become commonplace to blame the religion of Islam and waves of mostly Muslim migrants for the present ills in Europe and America. In my view, this is wrong. This is a false approach. Seldom, if ever, their criticism is leveled against the root causes of those ills, namely the domestic ruling elites who deliberately brought those peoples, those Muslims, those newcomers into our homelands. Which are the reasons for that? Well, there are three reasons you can enumerate real fast. First, you got this false altruism. Altruism. You read old Charles Dickens, Lady, Jellyby, how she actually pontificates about saving the world and so on. Back home here in London, and she pontificates about the plight of some tribes and some peoples back in Africa without even locating on the map the Africa itself. She just wants, as Charles Dickens called it, telescopic philanthropy. And this is pretty typical, for Antifas and for leftists. They like to talk about telescopic philanthropy, let's say in India and Bangladesh, without even realizing where those countries are. This is just one example. Moreover, religion cannot be used as a synonym for race or for ethnicity. This is false. Here in Europe, the vast majority of newly arrived migrants are indeed Muslims from Africa and Asia. However, keep in mind that in the United States of America, or at least those who would like to reach the shores of the United States of America, or rather swim across Rio Grande, are not Muslims. They're very, very pious Catholics. So here we got another problem. Sometimes I get a little bit upset when my colleagues, American nationalists, when they talk about Muslim threat. Well, America has about 10 million Muslims, which is less than the entire Balkan Peninsula. And France has about 7 million Muslims, mostly from 5 to 7 million, mostly from Northern Africa, yes, from Somalia and so on. So in the United States of America, officially there is 16 million non-documented or rather illegal migrants or immigrants, but the number is much higher. It's about 25 million. And most of those individuals, most of those people come from very strong Catholic family. They're not full-blooded Europeans, they're mostly mestizos, and of course this causes problems. And how is this going to end up in the months to come, in the years to come? We can now project some scenarios, but I'd rather not get involved in it. So again, let us not mix religion with ethnicity. For instance, I mentioned a while ago in a private discussion I had it with a guy here, with a gentleman. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have 2.5 million Muslims, autochthon Muslims, who are very white, very blonde, if you wish, who are very European, 100%. And they're Muslims. They belong to a different culture. They don't belong to my culture, my Catholic culture. But again, you cannot associate them, you cannot force them into non-Europeans. We can discuss that later on if you have some questions about the very explosive situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't want to get involved in theological disputes about the alleged goodness of Christianity versus alleged badness of Islam, as many of our friends do. Again, I don't want to hurt your feelings, your Christian feelings. I'm also a Christian. But listen, if you truly want to just argue along those, in my view, silly lines of, we are Christians, of course we got to, I'm Christians, I like drinking my coffee in front of Charles Notre Dame, and I prefer drinking my coffee in front of Cathedral in Zagreb instead of, I lived in Algeria for 3 years instead of drinking my coffee in front of a mosque. It's part of my optics, part of my visual, it's part of my genes, if you wish, and I guess it's quite normal. But arguing that Islam is a non-European religion and Christian allegedly being a European is also false. It's a false statement. After all, Christianity originated in the Middle East. It didn't originate in the woods of Germany, or for that matter in the mountains of Greece. I like the mountains of Greece and I like the woods of Germany. I like also my pre-Christian mythology, or for that matter my ancestry, and I'm proud of it. I'm also, despite of my Christian background, I'm proud to say that my memory stretches not just to Anno Domini 1 or 2, my collective memory stretches to Nibelungenlied, to the German mythology as well, of course the ancient Scots, ancient Vikings and so on. I know very little about them, but I know something about the German mythology as well. And I don't need to now pontificate about those runic sites and all those fancy, icons that some of our colleagues, somewhat sillily use and abuse. I guess we can start with Cicero, with Seneca, with great thinkers, pre-Christian thinkers as well. And I've learned a great deal from them. Now, what I can suggest to you before I finish this off, we should not forget that despite all this concern, despite those concerns and this worry, and then of course you never know what may happen. Another civil war might erupt, and the strife. We should not forget also that European Christians have fought terrible wars between themselves and among themselves. The latest one being in East Ukraine, just 25 years back in my home country. So I hate to say that, but I'm trying to sort of self-examine myself, and I do that on a daily basis. Yes, I'm not happy with the situation in London. I'm not happy with the situation in Marseille. I was recently in Atlanta. I was recently in LA. I lived in LA, where different rules prevail. You have to have a shotgun and 2 cell phones. You have to, first thing you buy, when you move into some neighborhood, a nice car with 2 tires, and of course you need some shotgun. It's still allowed there because it just gives us some psychological security. And I'm not happy with this. I realize the fact that Japan, for that matter, being a homogeneous society, is more or less a functional society, heterogeneous society, despite all those great, talks about humanity, diversity is a magic word, love thy neighbor and so on. Very seldom work. So I'm a cultural pessimist in this sense. In addition, ladies and gentlemen, we should not, this is my suggestion, we should approach politicians, we should, on a local level, we should approach also friendly media and tell them who we are, tell them that identitarians and sovereignists are not necessarily bad guys. We have nothing against other ethnicities, other ethnic groups, other races, other tribes, quite to the contrary. I can learn a great deal from them. I must tell you, yes, this is a digression. People who have hurt me most in my life were not non-Europeans, but my own people very often. If I ask individually anybody of you, you will tell me the same thing, that you've had most problems with folks from your own neighborhood and from your own gene pool, if I can put it that way. I must also add to that we must support our academics and folks who have fallen in disgrace and who have had troubles and who, for a variety of reasons, have been vilified and demonized by the media, with those ugly words that I mentioned earlier, including my friend Kevin MacDonald, Jar Taylor, Richard Spencer. These are all my good colleagues, and unfortunately many people who discuss about them don't know or know very little about them. They're not necessarily bad guys. Of course, we're not necessarily on the same boat. We disagree on some points. but I guess it is our duty also to support academics even here in the UK who provide, who can actually back up their claims with solid empirical research. Especially I'm referring here to Richard Lynn, he's a nice gentleman. And finally, what I already said, ladies and gentlemen, my heredity and my biology cannot be shrugged off. I consider that as my prime element in my identity. I can do my best and I can go to great lengths to accommodate the newcomers. I can tell them, look, I want to be your friends, but I always got to ask myself a very, very solemn questions. Is this putative friend of mine, whom I so desperately crave for, what does he think about me? How does he perceive me? How does he conceive of Tomislav Sunic? My identity, which can be dismissed, which can be ridiculed as whatever, the racial identity, what have you, may be awful in someone's ears, but I may ask a question and I will finish with that. In the coming years, we must decide where we stand, ladies and gentlemen and dear colleagues. Denying my identity, my ethnic identity, will not necessarily result in the denial of ethnic identity of my enemy. Thank you very much for your attention.
So a Q&A for Tom. If you have any questions, please just raise your hand.
Yes, sir. Well, I do, but it's a slightly cheeky question because I'm bouncing yours back to you. I thought it was very interesting. And you said that if you look at the Catalans and the Basques and all of those smaller subgroups within France or Spain, then they have as much a right to their identity as France does. And that is an interesting point. Where do you think that can we come to a logical answer where everything makes sense and we go, no, that's the correct scope of governance above you, or is it just an emotive thing that has to be thought of?
Oh, I would place at the first place our European identity. Again, as I said, this biological component plays a very important part. But at this stage, at least as far as I'm concerned, I've been pretty much exposed to the German culture, to the French culture, to Slavic culture as well. I grew up literally with Geoffrey Chaucer and Shakespeare, so again, let me put it that way. This tribal type of a nationalism, which solely relies on the exclusion of the other, is negative. It's certainly negative. We should try to build our identity on our common whole. And what I mean by that, which we got to regroup our peoples, our individuals from Scandinavia to Greece, if you wish, of our European ancestry. Which does not mean, as I said, that we got to that we have to exclude people of different races and of different cultures in Africa and Asia. All what I'm saying, let me recap that. Multiculturalism, when imposed from above by some decrees, by some abstract decrees, like in the United States of America, where they have affirmative action. You've sure heard about affirmative action. It's a nonsense. It's a dangerous nonsense. It creates this fake impression that you can create a la-la land, or what do you call it, a beautiful land, by just mixing people together. Like you go to Orlando, or Orlando in Florida, you go to Portland, or you go to Eugene, or you go to Washington, D.C. I get upset, I'll tell you now, a little bit more bluntly. People calling me or calling you a racist. Guys, you don't even realize how the Chinese, not all of them, how the Chinese hate the blacks in America. I'm talking about Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. You would never imagine, a woman, an American woman of Chinese descent dating a black guy. Or a Hispanic fellow, mixing around with a black guy. So, racism as a pathology is not just a hegemony, it's not just the privilege of whites. This is what we have to discard. Racism is a disease, it's all over. it is ingredient in all peoples, in all races. This lady of Palestinian origin, she's now a congresswoman in the United States. She's of Palestinian, Miss Tlaib. She made some very rude statements against Israel and so on, so forth. But then again, this gives you an idea that the American society nowadays has become so polarized to the extent that even folks who are implicit, I don't want to call them racist, implicit white, who are not necessarily, who have never even thought about being, waving with their white power and all this crap, but they are becoming aware that they are being threatened. Whether this is a self-perception or whether this is someone else's perception, I'll leave it to you. But the fact of the matter is, again, I repeat it again, I know it firsthand, multiculturalism, we call it multi-ethnicism back in communist Jews, it didn't work. How can it work 5 years down the road here in the UK? Or 10 years down the road? Where is the limit for accepting those migrants? I can tell you, in the case of emergency, people will start discovering who they are. And then the identity becomes very, very salient. I guess I've been pretty explicit with that, but go ahead and you can ask me more questions.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Going back to how you were talking about how words are used to silence political opponents.
Right.
Is there anything from your experience that we could take to combat those tactics? And can we or should we use similar tactics ourselves?
I'm very glad that you asked me this question because I was raised in this trauma. If you skip on the Wikipedia, you will find out where I'm coming from. My dad was an attorney, very Catholic attorney. He was even adopted by Amnesty International here in London in 83, 84, when I was in the States, when I was granted political asylum. Now the point is why I'm telling you this. I just got to backpedal a little bit. In the communist vernacular, in the communist universe, all over, be it in Czechoslovakia, if you read Rude Pravo is the official journal. I got to give you this background a little bit. Or Pravda in Russia. This term fascism and anti-fascism was constantly used on all wavelengths, 24 hours. So all people who were even in the slightest disagreement with the party line were called fascists. To the extent that that word became meaningless. And even nowadays, when people call me, Tom, you're a fascist, you're a white supremacist, I ask them, can you explain me that word? You ask me how can we combat that? Well, the point is, I'll tell you, I'm glad, first and foremost, I don't want to flatter you guys, I'm glad that you're here. I'm not talking about Gucci suits or Armani suits, but you're well dressed, you're okay. I certainly don't want to provoke my enemy with additional fodder and carry some insignia, you know what I mean, like swastikas, and this is passé, this is a non-starter. Or using some racial slogans or talking about white power. This is a provocation, these are agents provocateurs, and this is a non-starter. This will hurt you in the long run. I'm aware of the fact that my enemies and my detractors will always call me names. They will always. But how do I answer them? I ask them a question. Can you define, please, what fascism means? And always make a comparison with communist Yugoslavia. When I was a schoolboy, I went to catechism classes, which was not allowed to start with. Catechism classes were not allowed in communist Yugoslavia. I went nonetheless to church and so on. So they called me as a boy, I was a fascist. So everybody who was a Catholic was a fascist. So please try to dismiss this word. Do your best to explain. Ask here's my suggestion. If somebody asks you, Mr. Jones, do you realize that you are actually advocating the policy of white supremacists and fascists? And just kindly ask them the question, sir, could you please define this word white supremacism in my case? Just a simple question. Don't use disclaimers. If you use disclaimers, this is psychologically means that you're on retreat. If you use disclaimers, no, I'm not an anti-Semite, no, I'm not a racist, no, don't start like that. Just ask them, how do you define that? If somebody tells you you're anti-Islam, tell them, explain them a little bit. You know, the reason, again, can I go on for a little bit? I should have probably talked, but I don't want to take too much of the time. The word Turk in the Croatian vernacular has a very bad meaning, because we're fighting the Turks and Muslims, Croatians and Austrians and Serbs as well, for 500 years. But it doesn't mean that I have to demonize them, all of them now. See what I mean? I also demonize, as I said at the beginning, I'm sure I was straying away from my topic, class, self-hating class, called them white self-hating class in the United States, in the UK and the United States of America. Also the big oligarchy, the liberals, of course, were interested in having cheap labor, whatever, altruism. And anyway, I'm sorry, is there any more questions, sir? If not, yes, one more, a quick one. I'm sorry, I sort of started babbling and rambling, and you should tell me, Tom.
So maybe to end on a positive note, I know you said you're pessimistic.
Yes, I am.
By nature, but where or what are you optimistic about at the moment? Which country or movement or?
Well, I'm optimistic about this very fact that we have gathered here together.
Yeah.
Not with some crazy insignia, with some flags. And I guess what we need to work on, again, I would love to give a lecture on cultural hegemony. This is what I worked on with Alain de Benoit. This is important, this is crucial. We have no people, we have no academics, we have very few academics in academia in the UK. In America, it's a catastrophic. You cannot even declare yourself a conservative, you can run into trouble. So this is where we have to start. I realized, how many times I told you that, folks, I guess I'm probably I'll be bashful. When I was a kid, I dropped out in communist Yugoslavia, I had long hair, and I went to India hitchhiking. I was smoking dope and so on, because I didn't like the system, I didn't like the system. But then I realized later on, that if I get myself a degree, or any degree, it doesn't have to be a PhD degree, but if you get yourself a decent trade, you can far better and far more successfully fight the system than by using some slogans and some outdated and obsolete runic signs, which is okay, for scholars, you got to deal with that, but it's a non-starter for us. Try to ingratiate yourself, try to blend yourself into the system. I'm sure, folks, I know it's firsthand, I don't want to now mention the names, even some American diplomats that I'm familiar with, even some UK folks that I know of from The Guardian and so on. They're pretty much on the same page, we can say. But of course, people need their perks, they need their pension plans and so on, so it's normal. Just do it politely, abide by the laws. And of course, I'm aware of the fact that we always will be getting this stigma. You're a fascist, you are a white supremacist. Try to tell them, no, we are not. Well, thank you, folks, again for your patience, and I'm at your disposal. And thanks again to David. And yes, I need to extend my greetings from my friends Kevin MacDonald and from the American Freedom Party. Should you be interested in getting in touch with them, these are serious people, serious scholars. I'd be more than happy to talk about this. And please have a look at my books. And my wife's books. She writes nice poetry in French and English. Thank you.